to have fun, and to learn. Paulette, please.
All right, this will just be brief, as most of us have already heard Sandra speak before, Friday and Saturday morning. The theme of the weekend is Jewish responses in times of turmoil, which was Friday evening. Today, she talked about vulnerability and finding happiness within your vulnerability, in the sukkah, which is so temporary, in reeds which sway, but as opposed to a tall tree trunk, they bounce back again. Very moving to hear those, the midrashim. I'm not a person who looks to midrashim very much, but it's amazing how you bring what they said into our very lives today. Tonight, you're going to be talking about living in uncertain times. I don't know how you came up with that title, and our various Jewish coping strategies. Tomorrow at 10 in the morning, it will be different. Tomorrow it will be Artist Midrash, and it's a video presentation and talk. Is that correct? Don't know if it's going to tie in with the rest of the week or if it's going to leave us in a different kind of a high. But right now, I would like to turn it over to you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Paulette. So I'm so excited to be with you guys again. And yes, I wish I could do this in person, but we will get it done. As soon as everybody's vaccinated and it's safe to get together, we will get together. So what I prepared for you today is something that really, when COVID started a year ago, and it's hard to believe it's been a year already, I heard two kinds of Jewish responses. I heard one group saying, what Judaism says is completely irrelevant. Right now, what we need to do is follow guidelines from the government. I heard another opposite conversation, one happening especially in some neighborhoods in New York and New Jersey, which was, God's going to protect us. What the CDC says is completely irrelevant. What we need to do is just continue praying. Let's get together. Let's pray. Nobody's going to stop us from our regular prayers. What we need to do, we need to do. We are doing what God wants us to do. And I felt that those answers were not satisfactory, not for me. Obviously, the answer that we do what we need to do when God's going to protect us and forget what the CDC says is not one that I can take seriously. But on the other hand, the other answer, that Judaism has nothing to do with this, did not bode well with me for many reasons, but two main reasons. Number one, because I believe that Judaism always has something to say to me. At every instance of my life, there is something that I can learn from Judaism. Whether it is from the Talmud, from Midrash, from the Torah, there is importance and validity in what these sources tell me and have for me. But number two, it's not true. It is not true that you can be a very observant Jew and say, well, I just have to continue doing everything as normal because God's going to protect me. That is just not based on Jewish text. So what I did at that time is I said, let me go look at texts. Let me go look at what our tradition teaches us. Now, of course, rabbis in the Talmud or Maimonides or any other source that we're going to look at, we're not talking about a COVID pandemic, but they had plagues. They had health problems. This is not the first time the world is encountering a health issue. So I went back and I did some research and I collected sources. I was not the only one doing this. Many of my colleagues were doing the same thing. So what I'm going to present to you is a collection of sources that talk about what to do in terms of a crisis, a health crisis like the one we're living in. And I'm going to give you different pieces, and at the end, we're going to put them all together. Then I'm going to go into the second part, which is basically, so what do we do on an emotional level? How do we contain the anxiety? What do we do when we are anxious? We're dealing with something that is important, that is dangerous, that is deadly. Our lives have been totally changed. We are at a level of anxiety that we did not have a year ago. So how do we handle that? Again, what does Judaism have to teach me about this? So I'm going to be sharing my screen. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint so that you have all the sources in front of you. A couple of comments. Number one, please feel free to interrupt me anytime if you have a question. I am not going by a clock here. So I'm totally okay if we interrupt, have a question, we discuss, totally okay. You don't have to hold your questions until the very end. Number two, I will be more than happy then to send my PowerPoint to Rabbi Chorny so that if you want to have the sources, you can have them as well. So with that, Rabbi Chorny, can you allow me to share my screen, please?
Allow me to do that. I forgot
Sure.
to do the 1 second, please.
Sure. While Rabbi Chorny is getting me ready for that, what we're going to be doing then is looking at sources that speak about the importance of taking care of life, the importance of removing hazards, and that includes viruses, what we do when isolation is needed, and then we'll talk about fear and anxiety and what should a Jew do when we are facing a situation of anxiety or fear. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And here you have the first source coming straight from the book of Deuteronomy, right? Chapter 4, it says, and you shall guard yourselves very well. Now, here's the interesting thing. The context of this verse has nothing to do with health. However, the Talmud took these words, and you shall guard yourselves very well, and built on these words a lot of laws, a lot of comments that understood this as meaning you have to guard your lives very well. So even though the comment in the Torah, in its context, was about going into the land of Israel and how we were going to have to fight other nations, the rabbis understood that this was not just a war sentence, that it had a separate meaning about taking care of our own health. So here you go. Here is a verse from the tractate Yoma. You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances, which a person shall do and live by them. This is a verse in Leviticus. Now, the rabbis and the Talmud say, not that he should die by them. So they look at the verse and say, the verse is saying you should keep my laws, but then it says that a person has to do my laws and live by them. And the rabbis say, see, that means that you're not supposed to put your life at risk of death to fulfill mitzvot. So here's the first source that if you are telling me that Judaism doesn't have this and that you can go ahead with your crowded minyanim and everything that you want to do, I go, well, but the Talmud doesn't say that. The Talmud says that if there's a mitzvah that you need to do, but to do that mitzvah, you are going to risk death, then you should not do it. If you look at what I have here, these are some things that I took out of Talmud. And when I don't have the source next to it, it is only because it is in more than one place. So first of all, the Talmud speaks of a disinfectant that was used in Talmudic times to make sure that any clothing that was infected would be cleansed. And I kept, again, back a year ago when we were all desperately looking for disinfectants, right? We had those wipes, the Clorox wipes, and we were using everything and washing our hands and etc. When I came across this, I said, wow, it's not that new. The Talmud was already saying that there are certain times when you need to disinfect your clothing. Mar Samuel declared that diseases may be carried by caravans from land to land. And they believed that you should close your borders if there is that kind of a problem. And then I'm thinking, here we are dealing with a virus that was carried from land to land, right? And we had to decide, are we going to close our airports? Are we not going to close our airports? Who are we going to allow in? How are we going to control it? Members of a family with a sick person among them were to be avoided. Which again, what are we doing today? If somebody in a family has COVID, not only does that person have to be quarantined, but the government has asked that we all, members of that family that have been in touch with that person, also quarantine. They're not supposed to be in touch with other people. They discouraged kissing on the mouth and kissing only on the back of the hand. Why? because kissing on the front of the hand, you would put people at risk of touching their eyes or their mouth with a virus. So if it was only the back of the hand, it was considered safer. Then, during epidemics, population was advised to avoid crowding in narrow alleyways because of the danger of contagion in the air. So again, the rabbis are not talking about COVID, but you can see that the way the Talmud deals with a situation of an epidemic is not that different from what we are doing today, what the government, the CDC are telling us to do today. And Mar Samuel says, the washing of hands and feet in the morning is more effective than any remedy in the world. So you see how many times the Talmud is talking about things that we have been dealing with throughout this pandemic. Let me stop here. Does anybody have any questions, or is there anything here that surprises you that you did not expect to see in the Talmud? Right, Paulette was not. Harvey. Odette, go ahead. Harvey, you'll go after her. That. Go ahead.
Is there any recording of the 7 ingredients that you mentioned?
No. No, it's a good question.
Okay.
So,
But that.
so one of the mitzvot in the Torah at all times, not just the COVID time or not good times, is cleanliness. So cleanliness is a mitzvah, which we all know. So would that still relate to what we are talking about now? But my other question, one of the lines says, of course, you keep yourself clean in general, but why is there emphasis also on the feet?
So I don't know, but I can give you a guess. My guess is people did not walk around in shoes, right? So people walked around many times barefoot or in sandals, and sandals allow dirt to come in. So through your feet, when you came from the outside to the inside, you were actually transmitting more germs than in other ways. I will say that when COVID started, a lot of people started taking their shoes off before they came into the house.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
There is also a notion that people did not sit or sleep on furniture. People sat on pillows and they slept on the floor, on carpets. So if those were the same carpets that you were walking on, by definition, as Sandra indicated, you would be spreading the virus or the impurities, let's call them, on the carpets upon which you slept. So there's a variety of things. You know, the Muslim world incorporated the practice before prayer. Why? Again, because they walk into a mosque, which is an open room, carpeted usually, and they bow down and put their faces against the carpet.
The floor.
You don't want to breathe whatever people bring in their feet. So even before you walk into prayer, you wash your feet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Paulette, what surprised you?
Yes, it really all surprised me. It seems that maybe because of what my husband has studied in his Talmud class for so many years, they're talking about laws all the time. And what do you do with your neighbor's cattle? And if something falls over on your property, or if you find money, this is just so basic about life. And I didn't know that.
Talmud is an interesting combination of stories with moral lessons, of laws, and of very practical, I would say, laws or rules of living, which is why it bothered me when people said either that that Jewish sources had nothing to offer, or the opposite, that we are just allowed to do whatever we want. Like, no, you're not. The Talmud says you're not. So if you are an ultra-Orthodox Jew and you want to live an ultra-Orthodox life, well, then you can't just pick and choose, right? That's what we do. We pick and choose. If you're ultra-Orthodox and you claim to observe everything, you can't just forget that this is written, that this is there. This is not, a modern thing. And I'm going to go ahead.
I was going to say, Sandra, I'm always renewed when I recognize that everything old is new again. You know, we think we're so modern that we have reinvented the wheel, but I mean, everything here has already been, everything we're doing has already been done and already been tested and already been proven. And how lovely is that to know that our ancestors have walked in our footsteps before us, and we can look backwards and get support from that.
Yes, and I'm not a person that thinks that everything that is written you have to follow exactly the way it is written. I do recognize that sometimes there were things that the rabbis said in their days, given their knowledge, that we now know is not the case, right? And Maimonides actually, Maimonides makes a very interesting point. There's a comment in the Talmud that is based on the understanding that an 8-month-old fetus cannot survive, right? The Talmud made a comment based on this understanding, which was probably true in their days. In the times of Maimonides, an 8-month-old fetus could survive. So Maimonides said, when science proves Talmud wrong, we follow science. Now, that doesn't mean that you trash Talmud. You take whatever the Talmud says and look at it and say, well, now that I know that a baby today can survive 8 months fetus, or even a 7 or 6 or sometimes 5-month fetus can survive, how does that change what the rabbi said? So I understand that 2,000 years ago, they did not have the scientific knowledge that we did. But as you say, Shelley, you know, the world hasn't changed that much. So they didn't know about COVID, but they obviously knew about diseases that were transmitted from one person to the next. And they recognized that caravans could bring it from one place to another. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, show you a few more slides. Yes, go ahead.
One quick thing. I just wanted to suggest that it's obvious that Bill Gates has studied Talmud.
I wouldn't be surprised. By the way, I don't know how many of you know, but South Korea actually has a mandatory Talmud study for high school students in public school in South Korea. And it's not because they care about what the Talmud says, it's because they care of how the conversations happen in the Talmud. That there is always a debate, that there's always more than one opinion, and they think that that's very important to learn. So students in South Korea learn Talmud in school. I don't know which tractate they choose, but I find it fascinating. Okay, so Maimonides, who we know, was not only a very knowledgeable Jew, but was also a physician, whatever that meant in those days. Maimonides says a person needs to distance oneself from any damaging influences and has to live a healthy lifestyle. So Maimonides would even say that if you want to really understand Judaism, and if you want to follow the understanding of how a Jew should be living, you have to take care of your health. So you need to eat healthy, not just because the doctor said so, but because Judaism said so. Because Judaism said back in that verse that we started with, that you have to take care of your own bodies and your own health. Here is another collection of interesting things. This is from the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is the Code of Jewish Law that was published in 1500. Now, again, I want you to look at not just what it says, but what is the meaning behind it, because some of it will not be accurate for us. But look at this. One must refrain from putting coins in one's mouth, lest it's covered with dried saliva of those afflicted with boils. So the idea that a coin could have some saliva with somebody who's sick, and if you put it in your mouth, you're going to get sick, which is what we were talking about in the beginning of COVID, right? Not to put your hands in your mouth. He should not put the palm of his hand in his armpit, lest his hand touch a mitzorah or a harmful poison. A mitzorah was somebody who had some kind of skin disease, again, that could maybe be contagious, or a harmful poison. Now, today, we wouldn't say that putting a hand in your armpit is going to transmit disease. But maybe in those days, they did believe this. He should not put a loaf of bread under his armpit because of the sweat. He should not put a cooked item or drinks under the bed, since an evil spirit rests on them. He should not stick a knife in an etrog or a radish, lest one fall on its edge and die. Meaning, I'm going to stop here. If I now read this, I say, okay, I'm not concerned about the radish or the etrog. But let's look at the verse. The verse basically is saying, I can't do anything that is going to put somebody's life in danger, right? It's not about the knife. It's not about the etrog, and it's not about the radish. It's about the concept that I can't do something that may lead to somebody's life being in danger. Similarly, he should be careful of all things that cause danger, because danger is stricter than transgressions. And one should be more careful with an uncertain danger than with an uncertain prohibition. And here I go again. The Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, is saying danger is stricter than transgressions. So it is not okay for you to be gathering together to do some kind of mitzvah, of commandment, if by doing that, you are putting people's lives at risk. It's just not okay. And it's not me saying it, it's the Shulchan Aruch saying it. And here we continue. This is from the same text, it's just a continuation. They also prohibit to go in a dangerous place, such as under a leaning wall or alone at night. They also prohibited to drink water from rivers at night, or to put one's mouth on a stream of water and drink, because these matters have a concern of danger. And we today don't believe that a stream of water has any danger, but they did. And what they're saying is, if it's a dangerous place, you can't go. It's the widespread custom not to drink water during the equinox, and the early ones wrote this, and it is not to be changed. They also wrote, now look at this, they also wrote to flee from the city when a plague is in the city. And one should leave at the beginning of the plague, not at the end. And all of these things are because of the danger. And a person who guards his soul will distance himself from them, and it is prohibited to rely on a miracle in all of these matters. So, of course, when you have a world pandemic, leaving your city is not going to help. Where are you going to go? But the fact that the Shulchan Aruch is telling us you cannot rely on miracles. If we have information that it is dangerous, it is dangerous. You shouldn't go to that place. You're not allowed to say, I don't have to worry. I'm a good Jew. God's going to protect me. There is no such thing. Maybe God is going to protect you, but you're not allowed to rely on that. Good for you if God protects you, but you cannot rely on that. You cannot go to a situation of risk saying, I am protected by the one above. Whether you are or you are not, we don't know, but you can't count on that. Any questions? Wow. Right, Pat? I find this amazing that all of this is in our sources. None of this is modern. It's all there. Odette, go ahead.
Okay, so I find it fascinating, of course, and I'm very proud because that asserts our Jewishness, that everything happened from the Talmud. We're kind of smart about it. But the line that says in the city, when there's a plague in the city, you should leave the city. And in essence, something similar has happened, not exactly 100%, but at least in North America, I'm sure a lot of other places, people who could get away, there's congested places in a big city, people in apartments, small areas, they can't go out. If they could go and rent or buy a place outside the city, since anyway, most people were working virtually, I know a few friends have done that, then at least they felt a little bit at ease that they are safer than whatever it is. Of course, everything is relative, right? It's not a black and white, but yeah, when you look at the cities are big, and in essence, I'm not saying they shouldn't be healthy and safe for people, but that's what the pandemic is teaching us now.
I think it was we in Florida, we saw our real estate prices go up because a lot of people from New York moved down to Florida, whether for a couple of years or forever. I think it was a combination of two things. One is what you said. People realize that if they're living, for example, in Manhattan, and therefore there's an elevator in their apartment, and there are many people living together, the likelihood of you being exposed is much larger than if you're living in Florida, where we have larger lots. Most of us live in houses, not in buildings, so you don't share this public space. I think that was one. The other reason was that if you are locked in an apartment and people who had little kids are not going to school, and you're in a small apartment all day long, you're going crazy. And therefore, going to places where you could be in a house with a little bit of an outdoor area was just such a relief. So I think both things played into this. But you're right, it's all there. And when they said you should leave the city, I think they really did not imagine, could not have imagined a pandemic to the extent that we have, that the entire world was exposed to it. There was not a place. I mean, I remember in the beginning of the pandemic when they were saying, oh, this place there has been no case, and that place there has been no case. And it was only a question of time. And then the whole world had it.
Everything.
Okay, going back to sources.
Thank you.
Here you go, Mesilat Yesharim, 18th century. If you will point to the fact that the sages in all places have ordered that a man be especially attentive to his well-being and not put himself in danger, even if he is righteous and a doer of good deeds, that they have said, and then it cites the Talmud, all is in the hands of heaven, except chills and fever. I love this, right? When you're dealing with illness, we've got to put heaven a little aside. And the Torah states, be very watchful of yourselves. All of which indicates that a person is not to extend trust in God to this area, even as our sages state further, when a mitzvah is to be performed. Again, I don't understand how somebody cannot not understand what's written here. It is so clear that illness, you cannot rely on God. You cannot trust God when you're sick. When you're sick, you can pray to God, and I'll get to that in a second. But rely on God to say, I don't have to listen to doctors. I don't have to do anything that CDC is telling me because I rely on God is just not Judaism. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but don't call it Judaism because it is not Judaism. Here we go. Maimonides again. Any hazard that is potentially lethal, and we do know that COVID is potentially lethal, there is a positive commandment to remove it and to beware of it and to be extremely cautious in this matter. As it is stated, be careful and guard yourselves very well. And if one does not remove them or places obstacles that lead to danger, one has violated a positive commandment. And here again, right now, we can't remove COVID. We do the best we can, but you certainly have to be extremely cautious. So whatever situation you can avoid being in, you should be in. You should avoid it. So if you are a physician and you're working in a hospital and you happen to be treating patients, there's nothing you can do other than take the protections that you can take. However, you can't just say, I'm going to stay home. But certainly, if you're leaving the house to go out to pray or to go to a seudah, a Purim seudah or something like that, you shouldn't be doing it. And it's not because I said it, it's because Maimonides said it. It's because Judaism said it. It's because the Talmud says it. Here's another one from the Shulchan Aruch, basically the same thing. One has a positive duty to remove and guard oneself of any life-threatening obstacle. As it is said, beware and guard your soul. If one did not remove those obstacles, one has canceled a positive commandment and transgressed, do not bring blood guilt. I don't know in how many more words our tradition could have said that if we are living in times of danger, we have a Jewish obligation, not desire, obligation to take care of ourselves, to keep ourselves out of that which we can do, to protect our neighbors, to protect ourselves, to whether it is wearing masks, not going to crowded places. It's just all there. So let's talk now about isolation. So we all know that isolation is part of Jewish understanding. There are two sources in the book of Numbers that talk about putting people in quarantine, even if that word may not have been used directly, putting people in quarantine when you believe that they could transmit something. The first source on the right, it's from Numbers, book of Numbers, and it says, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, instruct the Israelites to remove from camp anyone with an eruption or a discharge and anyone defiled by a corpse. Remove female and female alike, put them outside the camp so that they do not defile the camp of those in whose midst I dwell. The children of Israel did so, they expelled them to the outside of the camp, right? And then later on in the same book, we know the story of Miriam. So Miriam is talking about her brother Moses. God gets upset and gives her some kind of a disease. It's not leprosy. It is many times translated as leprosy, but it is not the leprosy that we understand to be a disease today. But she has that disease, tzarat, and I purposely did not translate. Miriam was afflicted with tzarat. Let her be quarantined outside the camp for 7 days, and then she may be brought in. So Miriam was quarantined outside the camp for 7 days. So here we see that from the Torah, from the very beginning, there is this idea that when somebody could represent a potential danger, and what the rabbis understood and what the Torah meant was not as simple as the person has a virus. It's a little more complicated. It's like, why is the person ill? What does the skin disease represent? But that's not important for our conversation today. For our conversation today, what is important is that the Torah says when somebody is at the risk of contaminating the community, whether it is physically or spiritually, that person needs to be put in quarantine. Right? Now, when Miriam was put in quarantine, nobody moved. They all waited for 7 days. The caravans did not move on until she could rejoin them, and then they moved on with her. So it's not that we are shunning the person forever. It's not that you are, excluding the person from the community, but you are saying right now, you are a danger to the community, maybe of no fault of your own. Which, by the way, in Miriam's case, it is understood that it was by her own fault. But in the first text, if you were in touch with a corpse, and remember that burying a dead is a mitzvah, is a commandment. So if you had to bury a dead, you were in touch with a corpse. It's nothing that you did wrong, but they considered you to be impure. If you are impure, if you have something that could contaminate physically or spiritually the community, you are put in quarantine, just like we do today. Here is more from the Talmud. The sages taught, if there's a plague in the city, gather your feet, and then explain what that means. Limit the time you spend out of the house. As it is stated in the verse, and none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. And it says in another verse, come, my people, enter into your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourself for a little moment until the anger has passed by. That's a verse from the book of Isaiah. And the rabbis in the Talmud understood that referred the anger here, which Isaiah was not referring to a virus, but the anger here would apply if there is a plague. So if there's a plague, what do you need to do? You stay home, you close the door. You don't let anybody go out. You don't let anybody come in. And it says, outside the sword will bereave, and in the chambers terror. So here I have another example of Talmud saying if there is a plague, stay indoors, don't go out. Here's the continuation of that source. The Gemara says, what's the reason for citing the additional verses introduced with the term, and it says? So the question is basically, it is twice it says, and it says. Why do you need to say it twice? And why do you need to give me more verses to prove it? You already said it once. Why do I need more verses? And basically the answer is, the Gemara answers, if you would say that this matter, the final verse states that none of you shall go out until the morning, applies only at night. So because the verse said you're not supposed to go out until the morning, then somebody might say, oh, great. So in the morning I can go out, right? And then the Gemara teaches, no, you go in, you shut the door, not in the morning, not at night. You just do not go out if there's a plague in the city. You stay home. Anybody wants to, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Anybody wants to comment on anything that we've looked at so far? Or anybody has questions? Can anybody tell me how can one justify not following rules and saying the rules of COVID and saying that it is because they are Jewish? Because, you know, I can justify not observing rules. Some people are stupid. But how can you say that you're doing this because you are Jewish, when we see how careful the rabbis in the Talmud were? Jacob.
Can you imply the example that you gave about isolation? It is really, we must wear a mask, not just to protect us, but to protect others.
I think that the case of wearing a mask falls under many different categories, one of which I would say is the fact that you are told in the Torah that you cannot put a stumbling block in front of the blind. And I believe that by not wearing a mask, I am putting other people in danger. So even if I don't care, if I'm stupid enough not to care about my health, which by the way, is against Jewish law, but if I want to be stupid in that realm, I still have an obligation to protect the others. We cannot put somebody's life at risk. I mean, Judaism has this concept of not putting your life at risk and somebody else's life at risk to a very detailed degree. There are many things that we learn in our tradition. For example, the idea that the Torah says that you have to put a fence around the roof, right? Because you have to protect, first of all, we have that law in Florida that you have to put something around your pool. Your pool needs to be protected, right? And you ask them why. Like, I don't have children in the house. Why do I have to protect my pool? And the answer is because if the neighbor's child walks into your property, falls into the pool and dies, it's your fault, right? Well, Judaism says that very clearly, even though you go like, but wait a minute, I didn't invite the neighbor's child to come over. They just trespassed into my property. It doesn't make a difference. It's still your responsibility. And Jewishly speaking, that is also the case. So we have this concern to protect our lives and to protect the lives of others that it appears in different places in the Torah and in different ways in Torah and Talmud and Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. It's all there. It is a really important philosophical point. And the reason for that, and I know this is not popular in modern America, but the reason for that is because Judaism considers that your life is a gift from God. It's not yours to do whatever you want with it. It is a gift from God, and therefore we have an obligation to take care of it. And guess what? It's not just my life that is a gift from God. Everybody's life is a gift from God. So I have to protect my life as much as I have to protect other people's lives. They're equal gifts here. Okay.
So if I may go back to the question and run the risk of being a little bit politically incorrect, I think that in the very Orthodox communities where they believe they have to follow the guidelines of their leaders, despite the fact that the tradition is very clearly showing that behavior is undesirable, we are falling into a completely different category, a different phenomenon. And that is a phenomenon of authority, asserting authority.
Yes.
The rabbis in certain super Orthodox communities have a very tight hold on their people, their constituency, and they want to keep that power above the power that the state or any other authority may exercise. So their followers follow them blindly because they're not introduced to the text that you and I are studying tonight. As Paulette pointed out, for the most part, in the majority of schools, people will spend a lot of time reading Talmud texts that have to do with what we would call legalistic issues, torts, and commercial law, etc., etc. But these types of tractates that you are studying, they fall very far away from their milieu. Therefore, what you are seeing is a blind, people following blindly the authority of certain rabbis whose interest is maintaining authority, not maintaining the authority of halakha, but their own authority. Sadly, you could make a parallel to what we saw a couple of weeks ago in the Senate. People voted only to keep their seat, to keep their authority, to keep their power. They didn't vote in a way that was logical and imperative. Some rabbis will dictate to their communities along the same lines. And it's embarrassing to those of us who have the title and yet understand our mandate to be very, very different.
So I'm going to add another thing to that. I think what Rabbi said, first of all, it's true that they don't learn a lot of this. And there is a significant percentage of this population that does not know what's going on in the world. They don't watch TVs. They have smartphones with filters. They're actually called kosher phones, so that they don't have access to news, etc. And therefore they're ignorant. But I think there's something here that Rabbi said that is so dangerous, which is the idea that these rabbis want to have absolute control over their communities. I want to point out that, and this is not a criticism, this is a fact. Catholicism, or the Catholic Church, always had, at least until the last 100 years, always had the interest to keep its constituency ignorant so that the priests would have control over them. So in Catholicism, in the history of Catholicism, people did not know how to read. People did not have access to a Bible. The priests would share with them the parts of the Bible that they wanted to share. So when I see rabbis doing what Rabbi Chorny just mentioned, I look at it and say, but this is exactly what Judaism is not. Judaism always wanted the masses to be educated, wanted everybody to learn how to read, wanted every child to learn Talmud, at least all the boys to learn Talmud so that they could hold a conversation, right? Everybody had access to the biblical text. If not in person, you would listen to the reading of the Torah in shul every Shabbat, and you would actually have the whole reading, so you would know exactly what is there. So when our rabbis are, as in Jewish rabbis, are acting in a way that goes against the democratization of learning that Judaism expects, that is a problem. That's a real problem on many, many levels, not just on a COVID level or on a participation in American society level. And I understand that you want to keep your members focused on Judaism and not paying attention to what is happening out there in the world. But when it comes to a virus that could kill, and we know that many people died in these ultra-Orthodox communities exactly because they were not observing any of the measures of precaution, you know, you now have blood in your hands. I don't care how you look at it, but whether it is purposely or by negligence, you have blood in your hands. So moving on, we read a lot about what they talk about, etc. I want to discuss anxiety. So there is the episode that we all are familiar with of the golden calf in the book of Exodus. And we know why the golden calf happened, right? The people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain. They gathered against Aaron and said, let's make a god. That man, Moses, we don't know what has happened to him. We can say that this was a story of idolatry, which it ended up being. But I think we have an obligation to look at what led to this. And what led to this was they were expecting Moshe to come back. Moshe did not come back, and they were terrified. There is nobody to lead us. And therefore they asked for a golden calf. How they think the calf is going to lead them, that's a separate story, right? But the fact is that what led to this tragedy, which is one of the largest tragedies in the 5 books of Moses, was the fact that they were anxious. And anxiety leads to desperate measures. And desperate measures are usually not good for us because we don't think through, because we are scared and we're just trying to protect ourselves in the best way, but the best way is not necessarily the first thing that comes through your mind. So Judaism has a concern about anxiety, about the fact that anxiety doesn't really lead to anything good. And this is mentioned in the book of Proverbs, where it says, if there is an anxiety in a man's mind, let him quash it and turn it into joy with a good word. Now, of course, easier said than done. But the point that the verse is making is anxiety is not something good. And then in the Talmud, there is a discussion on what does this verse really mean? And they're stumbling on a word. Should we read it yashena or should we read it yeshina? It's in terms of the quash in the Hebrew. So Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi are disputing the verse's meaning. One said he should forcefully push it out of his mind. The one who worries should banish his concerns from his thoughts. Another one said it means he should tell others his concerns, which will lower his anxiety. Obviously, I prefer to go by the second one because the first one, even though it would probably be the best thing to do, just take it out of your mind, is not easy to do. When somebody is anxious, when there is an anxiety-provoking situation like the one we are living in for the last 12 months, it's not easy to just say, I shouldn't be anxious. Let me just take this out of my mind. If it were that easy, we would all be much happier. It's not. So the second interpretation in the Talmud, I like a lot. When you're feeling anxious, do not keep it to yourself. Talk about it. And isn't it amazing that 2,000 years later, it is only now that society is speaking about how important it is to have people who are mentally ill be able to speak about it. And when I say mentally ill, I don't mean crazy. I mean people suffering of depression or of anxiety, that it is so much better if instead of having to keep that inside because they feel they're going to be considered bad members of society, it's so important to have that opportunity to talk about it. Because when you talk to people who know how to help you, they can help you. And anxiety in a situation like the virus, which is not a mental health issue, meaning the fact that people are anxious in this situation is because of the situation. It's circumstantial. It's not a chemical imbalance in your brain. The ability to talk to other people about it and say, I'm anxious. I don't know what's going to be. I don't know when I'm going to be able to see my grandchildren or my children or my parents. I don't know how I'm going to survive this. I don't know when my life is going to go back to normal. Will I ever feel comfortable going to the movies again or anything like this? Talking to other people is really a way that Judaism tells us we can help diminish anxiety. Not cure it, but talk about it. It is probably one of the best things we can do. The Gemara quotes additional statements from the book of Ben Sira. Do not suffer from tomorrow's trouble. That is, do not worry about problems that might arise in the future, as you do not know what a day will bring. Perhaps when tomorrow comes, the individual who was so worried will not be among the living, and he was consequently upset over a world that is not his. I don't find this very uplifting because it says, don't worry because you might even not be here tomorrow. That's not uplifting. But the idea is that worrying about something that may arise in the future leads to nothing because you have no control. We are in a situation now, I think COVID is the perfect time to look at this, where we have no control. You don't know when this is going to be over. Some of us don't know when we're going to get the vaccine. Rabbi Troni and I were talking yesterday about it is so wonderful to not be old enough or sick enough to get the vaccine. On the other hand, if you're in your early 60s, but you haven't reached 65, you're not getting your vaccine so quickly. So, but worrying is not going to lead us to anything because there's nothing we can do. So Judaism believes that anxiety should be dealt with, not controlled. We can't control it. Nobody's anxious because they want to be anxious, but we need to deal with it in whichever way we can. We can try to remove it from our minds. We can talk so that it helps us put it out there. And we can just sit and think about the fact, what is it that I can control? And if I can't control, then maybe I shouldn't be worrying. Now, what can we do if we are anxious, right? All of this is very good advice, but what can we do when we are concerned, when we are anxious? So here are a couple of things. This was put together by Rabbi Joe Black, a Reform rabbi in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He said, these are the things, the Jewish things that we should be doing. Pikuach nefesh, right? Our top priority must be the health and safety of all. So as synagogues and as individuals, as a community and as individuals, we should always remember that our priority is the health and the safety of all. And if that means that synagogues need to be closed, synagogues need to be closed. And if that means that we're not going to be getting together for a Purim Seudah, that's what it means. And if it means that we're not going to have Seder with our children and grandchildren, that's what it means. Our top priority needs to be Pikuach Nefesh. Although we have to also observe, Al tifrosh min hatzibur. Do not separate yourself from the community. This comes from Pirkei Avot, from the ethics of the fathers. Remain connected to your community. That's why Zoom, it's not the same, but Zoom has been a blessing. It has allowed us to remain connected to our community, even if we can't be together. Simcha, that's what we were speaking about earlier this morning, rejoicing, even in times of difficulty. It is important to look for ways to celebrate life. We are alive. That in and of itself is a huge gift. And things may not be perfect. In fact, things may look really bad right now. However, we're alive, there's a future, and we have to find the moments of happiness and celebrate them. The fourth thing, Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is a Kabbalistic concept that says that when God created the world was filled with God's presence, and therefore there was no room for anything else. So God had to contract himself. And I learned once that it is as if there was a big vacuum cleaner that just sucked everything out. And so then human beings could live in the earth. So Rabbi Joe Black says there are times when we need to contract our emotional, physical, and spiritual needs so that we can make room for others. That links us to the community. Let's make sure that sometimes we are paying attention not just to how we are, but how everybody else is. I know you can't meet your friends for lunch, but you can always send an email, pick up the phone, call, see how everybody is doing. So keeping in touch with your community, but at the same time, contracting yourself at certain times to be able to help others. And lastly, comforting the afflicted, being present for all those who need you, who need to be comforted because they have gone through losses or because they simply are not handling this well. Those are the important things that we can do. There's also the Jewish prayer, which is something we can always do. In our weekday Shacharit Amidah, we have a paragraph where we speak about God, asking God to heal us. Heal us, O Lord, and we shall be healed. Save us, and we shall be saved, for you are our praise. Bring complete healing to all our wounds. And then there's the prayer for the sick person, the Mishaberach, right? May it be your will in front of you, O Lord, my God, and the God of my forefathers, that you quickly send a complete recovery from the heavens, a recovery of the soul, a recovery of the body to the sick person. You put the name among the sick ones of Israel. For you are God and King, the faithful and merciful healer. Blessed are you, O Lord, who heals the sick of his people, Israel. I want to point out, prayer works. And yet, when I say prayer works, what I mean is, when somebody is ill and they know that there are people praying for them, it gives them the confidence that they are not alone, that they have not been abandoned, and that people are thinking about their well-being. B, when we pray, we feel comforted. It gives us some sense of being held in the arms of God. And yet, as we saw in the earlier sources, prayer alone is not what we're supposed to be doing. Because even though we are praying, and even though we are saying, God, you heal the sick, we were also told by our sources that we cannot rely solely on God and that we cannot rely on miracles. So when I say we should pray, it is not pray instead of anything else. It's just talk to God about healing the sick. And I want to not end the night, end my presentation, and then I really want us to have a conversation about this. I want to end the night with a beautiful rendition of a healing prayer. This is by a young choir, kids. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Hazamir. It's a children's choir. This is an alumni presentation, so they're older. They're all in their early 20s here. And it's a song that I think is beautiful. It talks about healing us and healing the world. So here you go. Let's see if I can get this to play. Yes, Rabbi.
We may not get the sound if you didn't share the sound to begin with. So play it and see if the sound comes through. Otherwise, you're going to have to close the share and share again.
I think the sound will come through. Do me a favor, Rabbi. Let me know if it doesn't. Yes?
It seems to be coming through, yes.
אל קרוב לכל קורב, אך קרוב ליראיו אישו. We pray for healing of the body. We pray for healing of the soul, for strength of flesh and mind and spirit. We pray to once again be whole. Oh, please heal us now. Refuat nefesh, refuat guf, refuat shelima.
And there you go. I hope you enjoyed it. I love this. I love this rendition. I love the fact that it's Jewish kids. It reminds us that we have a future, that as much as we look at our sources in the past, we also have to make sure that this love of Judaism and of learning is passed down to our children so that they can keep this going. So let's talk. How do you see, what questions, how do you see what Judaism is telling us to do? What are the things you would like to talk about?
I'd like to say that, and I was thinking of this earlier in one of the last slides you had, the first item. Rabbi Charney has mentioned it on a number of occasions. Pekuah nefesh, preserving life, preserving a soul, is really the premier mitzvah that we can do. And whether it's our own or caring for others and being sensitive to others, mask wearing seems to be a very important part of everything you've spoken about from hundreds, if not 1,000 years ago to the very present day, where a lot of people say, oh, it's not that important, but yet it's not even so much to preserve our life, but to be certain that we're not contaminating others inadvertently, if you will. So I really think that pulled it all together for me.
Yes, I believe that today, masks, social distancing. Now, I'm relying on the specialists to tell us that, right? And the specialists are saying, so that's why I said in the beginning, you know, I don't like to, when people say, I only rely on this, what the CDC says, Judaism has nothing to do with this. That's not true, because Judaism has to do with it. Judaism teaches us how to act in our lives, how to live moral lives, how to take care of others, etc. With that said, we obviously listen to the specialists, the scientists. So masks, social distancing, not going to places where there are a lot of people, you know, trying to the extent that it is possible. Some people have to go to work. If you can work online, you work online. To go out and put your life at risk and put other people's lives at risk. You may get the virus, not become sick, but not even know that you have the virus and give it to somebody else.
But I find, though, that the ultra-Orthodox is a tremendous contradiction where they're so concerned about so many little details, but yet they ignore this in terms of caring for their own body. Many of them are heavy smokers. So not only are they doing something to destroy their own body, but the secondary smoke that could affect people around them. All of this is contradictory to what you've just presented tonight and what we know as being basic Jewish principles.
100%. And I think everybody has a right to be stupid. It's a God-given right. What you don't have is the right to say that you're doing this because you are observing Judaism. That's where you're wrong. If you're doing this because you're silly, that's okay. You want to smoke, you go ahead and smoke. You want to overeat, you want to go out and be in crowded places. That's your prerogative. You have, I guess, you know, every human being has free will. That's a God-given thing. But to say that you're doing it in the name of Judaism, no, that really you cannot say. Harvey?
Okay. I think the bottom line of everything that we've looked at tonight is follow the rules, be safe, take care of yourself, and take care of others.
Correct.
Covers the whole thing.
Correct. Shelley?
I want to go back to means of dealing with anxiety, because though I don't necessarily agree with the way the Talmud puts it, I do believe that worrying is a useless effort. Not because I may not be around, but because things I worry about probably won't happen. Most of the things that really, I think people spend excessive amount of time and get anxious about, they don't come to fruition. And so it's wasted energy. But I think to tie it all together, what I have recognized, particularly in COVID, is how important it is to live in the present. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. I mean, perhaps Hashem does. I'd like to think he has a plan, but I certainly don't know what that big picture looks like. And living in the present, I spend a huge amount of time traveling back and forth from Toronto, Canada to Florida. And I have never found that time has passed as quickly as it has this year during COVID. And that amazes me because I've sat back and I've said, why? Why is time seeming to go so quickly? It's almost a year since I was forced to leave Florida. I don't know where the time has gone, but my answer to that is always I am looking forward to something. I'm not planning something. I'm not necessarily really focused on where I am, where my feet are in the moment, in the present. Through COVID, I've had no choice. I've had to live in the present. And when you take one day at a time and live fully in the present, number one, time goes quickly. You don't focus on tomorrow, so your anxiety level is less. And you are able to find ways of making now meaningful so that you have memories, because who knows, we're never going to get this time back. And I want to be able to look at it and say, okay, like you said, Zoom has been a gift. What an amazing, amazing gift. I have been able to stay connected to my family and my loved ones, my chosen family at Beth Tikvah by a click of a button. And when I'm not there, I never have that opportunity. So I'm looking at living in the present, reducing my anxiety that way, and not thinking about what tomorrow will bring, but how can I make today special?
And you just gave an example of the simcha, Shelley, that you can be in touch with your Florida family, even being far away. Ed.
When I didn't learn much about Judaism when I was young, but as an adult, I've studied for a long time, and I love all the sources that you bring. I want to add one source that's been very helpful for me, and that's my mother. My mother taught me never to underestimate the ignorance of the American people. Now, in Illinois, where we are snowbirds from, everyone wears a mask. It's no big deal. You go out and the street is full of people with masks. We come to Florida and it's astounding to see how many people just do not wear masks. In stores where it says a mask is mandatory in order to come in here, it makes no impression on the ignoramuses who will not wear them.
And by the way, what drives me crazy is when people say, this is a free country and I can do whatever I want. This country does not allow me to walk around naked on the streets. It just doesn't. If I decide that I want to walk around naked, I'll go to jail. So the only thing that we're doing is somebody decided which body parts had to be covered, right? I mean, if you're in a beach town, if people are walking around in bikinis, it's okay. Yet they can't take their bikinis off. So somebody decided which are the body parts that we have to cover. Right now, the mouth and the nose are body parts that we need to cover, period, end of story. I don't understand why this is so complicated, right? If the government can force me to cover my breasts, then the government can force me to cover my nose and my mouth. It's simple to use that. And yes, you're right. The level of ignorance is huge. When people are screaming, it's my right. I can choose what do I want to do or not. I live in a free country.
Unfortunately, part of the problem is that wearing a mask was used as a political weapon in the course of the last year. I think we have evolved out of that, and presumably the government, the authorities are giving us a better example, and more of the society will abide by the standard. I see that some guy has his hand up. If you don't mind transferring the word to him.
Sure.
Unmute.
Brenda, make sure you unmute.
It's just a question I'd like to ask you, Rabbi. We're actually having dinner, Zoom dinner. We have them every Saturday night with friends. So we tape this. So I haven't watched you today. This morning was really, really good. Very thought-provoking, and you left us a lot to think about. And what I really liked about it is you started with the topic, and the topic was woven throughout the session, and it closed on the topic, and very, very well done.
Thank you.
I have a question though. The friend that we're Zooming, he wears a mask, but he has never got a flu shot. We're from Canada. He's never had a flu shot. I asked him, I said, are you going to get the vaccine? He said, no, it's not proven. And we won't let him in the house if he doesn't get a shot. So what do you say to him?
So, okay. So first of all, I'm going to start with a half agreement with him. The agreement meaning that we don't know what are going to be the consequences of this shot in the long run. That's the only part that I will agree with. We don't have enough knowledge. With that said, we do know what happens when people contract COVID. So if I were 30 years old, I don't know if I would take it or not. I really don't know. My kids, thank God, are all taking it, and it wasn't because I said so. However, once you are at a certain age, you absolutely need to get the vaccine. And if you decide not to take the vaccine, what you are doing is the right thing. No vaccine, you don't come into my house. And when I hear people speaking about it's only 95% effective, that's true. So is every other shot that we give our kids. 95% effective is what all shots are. So it's not 100%. None of our vaccinations are 100%. This is as good as it gets. The only issue is long-term side effects, which obviously we don't have the time to know. The other thing that I say, and as Rabbi Chorny, I have family in South America. My Brazilian family is now ready to get the shots, but in Brazil, the shots that are being given are coming from China. I would be very concerned. Not concerned because that's where COVID started. No conspiracy theory here. Only because I really don't know, have all of the important steps been taken before you start giving the shots? In the United States, the shots are only being given after approval from the FDA. You can't say that you don't trust the FDA. You can say that in the long run, what happens 10 years from now? What if there is a side effect that 10 years later, they find that people who took the shot were most likely to get whatever? That could happen. But then again, if I die of COVID, it makes no difference what would happen in 10 years. So I think we do have an obligation to take a shot. And I agree with you, if people who are not being vaccinated by choice, I will not allow them into my house either. You have to protect yourself. You have an obligation to protect yourself, your family.
Joyce has a comment.
Oh, I was going to say that this country has forgotten one important word that they choose to ignore. When we talk about America, it's to the republic. And the way a republic reads, it's for the good of the country. You can have a democracy, but if the democracy is wrong and people know it's wrong, it could be outvoted by the idea of a republic. And nobody seems to consider what the good of the country is. It became so political and so lopsided.
And that's the beauty of the Jewish sources, because the Jewish sources are looking at it exactly from that perspective. It's for the good of the community. It has nothing to do with politics. It's not about which rabbi is smarter, which rabbi, should have a say. It's all for what is good for the population. If it is dangerous, you don't do it. So if they consider that it's dangerous to put the bread loaf under your armpit, as silly as it seems to us today, right? That's okay. So today we don't think that's something important, so we don't do it that way. But the philosophy behind it is things that are dangerous, we should not engage in. That's it. That's it. And it's all for the good of the community.
Is there another comment before we close our discussion?
One point, Alfie Oakes here in Naples says wearing a mask is unconstitutional.
I've heard that too.
And there's no cure for stupidity. Just keep that in mind.
Right. And I'll say what I would say to that, if it came to that point, I would say it may be unconstitutional. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. What I do know is that by Jewish philosophy, law, etc., I have to wear a mask because I have an obligation to protect you.
My wife and I don't shop in that store anymore.
Odette?
Okay, so Rabbi Lilienthal, thank you. I don't want to exhaust you. Something else is on my mind, and I want to pick your brain. If it came, we have all heard of people dying in long-term homes. We have lost our mother a year ago. In fact, within 2 weeks of the pandemic, and she was in mild dementia. She had a caregiver that goes with her, but as soon as whatever the public health was sounding the alarm, the doors closed. They would not allow family. They would not allow anybody. For 2-3 weeks, we couldn't get hold of her. There was just a whole balagan, nobody answering the phone. I'm sure the people who are working there didn't know what hit them. Anyway, so at the end of it, my mother died of COVID too. We only heard the week before. By then she was, by the time we connected with her then, she was not thing. So apart from that, I know a lot of people have suffered like that. But what happens after the grief, where we couldn't go to her funeral, we couldn't have a Shiva, there was no Zoom, nothing. So there was no closure that way. But I think bottom line, I think what we narrowed it down now, why we are feeling so bad, is that how was she feeling? She was just like a little kid, and all of a sudden, what was she thinking? My son, my daughter is not here. They used to go, there's a phone, there is something, some connection, a human connection that's only familiar to her, because she won't understand, even if they told her there's COVID or whatever, she won't understand this. So that remained in our mind, like, how did she spend those last few days? And I'm sorry, I don't want to bring doom and gloom to anybody, but a lot of these things have happened to many, many people in the last year. What is there anything in Judaism that would say, I mean, obviously there's no magic bullet there, that will give some closure to people would say, well, how do you accept or accept that, basically?
I think that's a question more for Rabbi Shorny than for me, although I will say that I honestly, I believe in an afterlife. So I don't know what she knew or didn't know while things were happening. I think it's very difficult, especially with dementia patients, to know how much they understand or they don't, and what was told or wasn't told. But I do believe that after her passing, she's at a soul level where anything that she needed to know, for sure, she does know. So that's how I feel about it. And I think that's comforting. But again, that is a rabbi question. So Rabbi Attorney, it's for you.
I feel your pain, Paulette, because my mother died in November in similar situations. In fact, my mother was not demented or anything. She was in full use of her faculties. It took her in 5 hours. And I know that the last 3 or 4 hours of her life, she could not communicate, she could not do anything. So you ask yourself what went through her mind. And I hope that what went through her mind, as does through mine, is the notion that at that time, the blessing that we recite, Baruch Dayan Emet, is what is the predominant thought. God is ultimately a judge, and we can but accept his decree and live by it. I'm sad that you didn't have a closure. Your loss was at the very beginning of the pandemic, and we didn't know how to do what we know now I thank everybody for being there for us last couple of months after my mother died, and we had a minyan and we had Shiva, as we've had for so many others. But I think that you need to live with the reassurance, one, that she was not alone, that people in her care were with her, and I'm sure of this, and that they probably did explain to her. We got the nurses to call us and say to us, you better talk to your mom. She may not respond to you, but she needs to hear your voice. And we had that gift. Unfortunately, I don't know if that was the case for you, but as Dr. Lilienthal says, the reassurance that she is in a different state of existence, in a different reality, we call it a spiritual world looking down of us, should be reassuring to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
Paulette.
We've come to the end of our talk. Sandra, it was a wonderful evening. I know at the end we've had some far-ranging talks that speak to our own anxieties, our own lack of ability to be with our dear ones, as Odette was saying, and Rabbi. A lot to think about. Get a good night's sleep, everybody. Rabbi, is there a minyan in the morning you want to tell everybody about?
Yes, minyan.
By the lecture.
Minyan begins at 9 a.m. with the use of the orange link. As soon as we finish the minyan, we turn over to the blue link, which you used to join us tonight, and we'll be able to have a beautiful time together again, starting with Dr. Lilienthal and learning a little bit more about the makeup of our Jewish mind, our collective Jewish mind, which after all is tuned in into one particular goal. The goal of the Jew is to reach a higher state of existence, physically and emotionally, etc. Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani. God commands us to be holy because He is holy. And holy doesn't mean divine. Holy means to be a little bit higher than the fray and to understand obligations, responsibilities, privileges, as much as the recognition of the gifts that we have. I was very touched by the story of the nonagenarian Italian guy who wanted to thank God for every breath he breathed for 93 years. That is what sets us apart as Jews. The recognition that we answer indeed to a higher authority and we try to emulate it. I don't want to have the last word. Sandra, I'm going to leave you with the last word.
That doesn't usually happen. Okay. So I just want to tell you what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're actually going to be looking at several pieces of art, both Jewish and not Jewish. Because the goal of tomorrow, it's different. It's not anxiety provoking, although it is on the story, the most anxiety provoking story of our Bible, which is the story of the binding of Isaac. And what I propose is that art is also a form of midrash. So we're going to start by discussing what midrash is. Then we're going to read together the passage that we all know, but I still want to read together with you for there's a specific reason. And then we're going to go and look at art pieces and see how art fills in certain blanks. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Rabbi, it's at 10 a.m.?
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. I look forward to seeing you everyone at 10, and have a good night, everyone. Shavua tov.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was amazing.